Florida's GOP-controlled House and Senate passed a bill that would ban certain instruction about sexual orientation and gender identity in the classroom. The legislation now awaits approval from Governor Ron DeSantis, who has signaled his support. Proponents of the Parental Rights in Education bill say it's needed to give parents more oversight about what their students learn and discuss at school. Opponents, however, argue the ban would negatively impact an already marginalized community. So joining me now are two parents who see the bill very differently. Tiffany Justice is the co-founder of Moms of Liberty, and Todd Delmay is a Florida parent and activist. Welcome to both of you. I'm so glad to have you here. And Todd, I want to start with you. You live in a same-sex parent household, and you say this bill would hurt your family. Explain how.
Well, absolutely, and thank you for having me. It is so important that we allow children to grow up in safe environments, and I have worked for many years to gain the rights of being a parent and the opportunity to be a family. And so we have worked very hard to make sure that our son is growing up in environments where he is accepted. And I'm very concerned about this because it allows parents who have a very different view than we do to have influence over the world in which my son is growing up. I'm concerned that in the classroom, he won't be able to talk about his family in the same way that anyone else might be able to talk about theirs. And I think it's a real shame because, look, our son is growing up in a world that is full of all kinds of different people. He's known since he was a very young child that his dads are gay. And he knows that we love each other and we love him. And that's all that matters to a child his age.
Okay, Tiffany, to you, what about if a child like Todd's wants to talk about his or her home life at school? Should they feel singled out and isolated, like it's wrong to be in a family that doesn't look like other families?
Absolutely not. And that's not what the Parental Rights in Education bill does, to be honest. I want to say, too, I'm a mom who lives in Florida. I have 4 children who attend public schools here, and I want every child to feel safe and valued in our classrooms. I served as a school board member and stood up for those things when I served. Nothing about this bill prohibits any child from sharing information about their family. And I just want to make it clear, from Moms for Liberty parents, I don't see that there's a different side than Todd's. We want families to be strong and loving and to care for their children. And we want to help support parents in being an active part in their children's lives. And that's exactly what this bill, HB 1557, Parental Rights in Education, does.
Todd, to you, this applies only to children under the age of 9, kindergarten to 9 years old, young children. What is the harm in waiting until kids reach the 4th grade to talk about issues like this?
Well, look, LGBTQ people, we are a normal, healthy part of every community. And this idea that there is something dangerous or different about LGBTQ people that is not, that we cannot talk to children under the age of 9 about is absolutely preposterous. Like I said, my son is known from a very early age that he has 2 dads. They are gay, they love each other, and that's all that matters. And this really goes beyond just simply saying that kids can talk about their families. We need to be able to talk in curriculum about how families with a mom and a dad are no different than families with 2 dads or 2 moms. This goes beyond just someone coming into the classroom and telling their story about their individual family. But these are families that they see out in the world. Every child, I would imagine, in their own community, may not be their parents, it may not be somebody in their family, but somebody in their community, somebody in their church, somebody down the street is LGBTQ. And to try and pretend that we are not a normal, healthy part of everyday society, and we should be equal access, equal opportunity in the curriculum, I think it's dangerous.
Tiffany, how do you respond to that? And understandably, you want parental control over school curriculum, but Todd's a parent too. Shouldn't he also have a say?
Yeah, and Todd should read the bill. Here's the problem. This is a disingenuous argumentative conversation that we are having, because nothing in the bill says anything about the fact that Todd and his husband can't be celebrated as a part of a family in a classroom. Let me be clear about what this bill does. This bill makes it clear that classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity is not appropriate in grades K through 3. It also empowers parents by requiring school boards to notify parents if there's a change in a child's mental health. Nothing about what Todd just said is included in the bill, and I think it's really unfortunate that we've had a media that has slandered this parental rights and education bill, and it has led to parents like Todd being misinformed about what actually is contained in this legislation. And again, I'm here to set the record straight. Nothing about this bill says don't say gay. What a ridiculous moniker to give to good parental rights legislation that respects and protects my rights as a parent and yours, Todd.
Just to be clear, we didn't call it that, and I don't think Todd called it that in this interview either. Todd,
no, but that's what the media has called it. That's what the media has called it, and I think it's important to recognize the fact that, I can't blame parents like Todd if they somehow think that this is going to hurt their family. The way the media and the President of the United States and the press secretary has spoken about this bill, again, has been disingenuous. It's a lie.
Okay, well, let's stay with the focus on the substance of the bill, and Todd, your response to Tiffany.
Well, I have read the bill, and I actually sat through all of the testimony in the House and the Senate, and I've heard very clearly that this goes beyond that. They said the quiet part out loud. They believe that too many children and too many people in general are coming out, and they are trying to do something to stop this. Part of the issue here is that
ridiculous.
So part of the issue here is that the people who are putting this forward are trying to pretend like it is some innocent thing. And then they will say on the other side that, oh no, this is about not having X-rated conversations with children, as the Governor DeSantis put out the other day. This is not the purpose. I would be actually on board of not having that because we don't have those conversations with children. It seems that this is a solution in search of a problem.
So I can answer back to that if I could, please.
Sure.
Thank you very much. What's happening is that parents are awake. So not only are they paying attention to what's happening in Florida, but they're paying attention to what's happening around the country. And we're seeing things like the genderbread exercise where children are being told in kindergarten that they can choose to be a boy or a girl or not a boy or a girl, or a boy and a girl, is not something that parents want discussed with their kindergartners. What is happening in the classrooms in Florida is this. January Littlejohn, a parent of a 13-year-old girl, her daughter was put into a gender transition program in Leon County, Florida, without the parents' consent or knowledge. Another little girl in Clay County attempted suicide at school. When the parents arrived, they found out their daughter had been put into a social gender transition program without their consent or knowledge. Todd, their daughter was being Baker acted. They were removed from important decisions that they should be a part of in their children's education. I can only think as a parent of a middle schooler now that you also want to be a part of those important conversations in your children's lives.
Let me just jump in quickly. Todd, this bill does encourage parents to talk to their kids about these types of issues, right? It doesn't ban talking about them in the school altogether, but just informal lessons. Is this not a personal family choice that should be talked about at home and not in school?
Absolutely, and every family should be talking about these things at home with their family. Unfortunately, not every child finds a safe space at home. They don't find necessarily a safe space in their faith community. So school sometimes is the last resort where they need to find a safe space. Look, I remember hearing the bill sponsor saying, we never talked about gender identity or sexual orientation when we were kids, and they're absolutely right. But that was a problem. I am telling you, as the gay kid that I'm sure you all grew up with, that could be very lonely and could feel very much like there was something wrong with me. And we need to be able to have...
But Todd, isn't it dangerous to say that because some parents may abuse their children, that parental rights in general, that we shouldn't allow parents to have conversations with their children? I have no doubt that years ago it was very difficult to come out as gay to your parents, but we are in 2022 now. I have 4 children. Don't tell my children that home is not a safe place for them, that they're only safe at school, and that's the message that they're getting.
Well, Tiffany, but Tiffany, to be fair, your household might not look like every other household.
But parental rights are fundamental. The government does not give those to you, and they cannot take that away. And the parents absolutely need to be a part of every important conversation happening in their children's lives. And that's what 1557 does. It strengthens the parent-child relationship by requiring the school to tell the child that they need to bring these issues to their parents. It brings parents in. Schools need parents. Parents are the #1 driver of student success. And any attempt to cut parents out of their children's lives is a mistake. And as a parent and Moms for Liberty, we're going to fight for parents.
Well, I don't think Todd was advocating to cut parents cents out of their children's education or their children's lives. So, Tiffany, is it your position that kids will think of sex if they hear about a same-sex couple any more than they would if they saw a straight couple?
Absolutely not. But I would like to know when we started talking about sex to kindergartners. If a child says I have two mommies, or I have two daddies, or I have a daddy and a mommy, or I have only a mommy and I don't have a daddy, the answer back from a teacher needs to be there are lots of different types of families, and families are wonderful, and we embrace the idea of family. That's the answer. And I think we should be able to have conversations about all of these things in a non-sexual way with children in grades K through 3.
And Todd, your position on that?
Well, nothing has ever been about having sexual conversations with children. That is twisting what has been the thrust of our argument here, is that families need to be able to be represented, and we should be able to have a normal, healthy conversation with children about two moms and two dads being a normal part of society. It is not about sex, and that is where this gets to be twisted. Look, parents have all kinds of access to what their kids are learning in school. They have opportunities to, we can text, we can email, we can contact our teachers all the time. There's plenty of access here. This is not about taking away anyone's rights, but it is representing a smaller and smaller percentage of the state and of the country that has a very different worldview, where if you do not look like, sound like, or talk like the people that are passing these bills, you have to be cut out of the conversation. We can't talk about that. I think we should have a view where everyone is welcome, no matter who they are, no matter whom they love. And there are absolutely age-appropriate ways to do that. It's in the Florida curriculum. It's already existed. There's no need to be creating this other environment. And what's, I think, most important here to note is that this legislation creates not only a penalty, but a real fear in teachers that maybe some family thinks that their child heard some word in school, and it gives them all kinds of new legal avenues to go after school boards and teachers. I find that very dangerous. If you are uncomfortable with something that is happening in your classroom, you need to have a communication with the teacher and find out what it is. But there are no conversations happening with children at an inappropriate age about sex, sexual acts, or anything beyond what's age appropriate.
All right, Todd and Tiffany, I'm sorry I have to leave it here, but thank you for having this respectful conversation on both sides. Really appreciate both of you and your time today. And it seems like you actually do have more in common than you might think.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.